So last time we looked at Rostow's theory of development and how he supposes that every country is going to look like the United States, every country is going to look like United Kingdom. And now we're going to look at two other theories that really take into account how the world is developing now that we have become much more globalized, we're much more connected, and we are very interdependent countries. Here's our objective once again for 7.5 to explain the different theories of economic and social development. We are going to be looking at Wallerstein's world system theory and the dependency theory, commodity dependence, and we're also going to help explain the spatial variations in development. So let's look at Wallerstein's world system theory, also known as the core periphery model. And then we're going to be looking at the Brandt line, which is also called the north-south divide. Wallerstein explains the spatial relationships between countries and explains uneven economic development. That is interdependence. So all of the countries of the world are dependent on one another. As we've talked about before with the primary, tertiary, and secondary sectors, different parts of the world specialize in those different sectors, but all of the sectors are needed. You can't just say, oh, okay, well, we're really developed, so we're only going to work in the tertiary sector and we don't need any of that primary sector stuff. Well, yeah, we do. We could not maintain the lifestyle that we have at all without that primary sector of stuff. What's primary sector? Well, farming. What else? Mining. And your cell phones, they run on lithium batteries, and lithium comes from some mineral that's mined in Africa. I mean, we can't live without this stuff. We're learning on computers. We couldn't operate these computers without mining. All of this is we're all very interconnected. And so the core periphery model, that's what I usually call it. Wallerstein's world systems theory could be another way that it's labeled. And unfortunately, on the AP exam, they're not going to list all of them. They will list, like if you're given an FRQ question, they'll refer to the world systems theory. They may not even mention core periphery. You learned it as core periphery, and now you're like, oh no, I don't even know what this is. Well, so that's why you have to learn both names for something. So why do I like it to call it core periphery? Because to me, it just really makes sense. So there are certain countries in the world that are core countries. And it doesn't mean we're not core because we're the most important. We're core because we have the most developed economy. So those in the orange are your core countries. The ones you know really well are the United States, Canada, Australia, most of Western Europe are core countries. And then you have your semi-periphery countries. So when we watched the How Not to Be Ignorant About the World video, Hans Rosling talks about how most of the world's in the middle. And so if you look at the populations in, for example, China and India, those are the two largest populated countries in the world. And they're in the middle. Brazil, really highly populated, in the middle. Most of the population is in the middle, and even in the countries that are considered periphery. So this is where a lot of your primary sector is done. And even those countries that are in the periphery, they do still have a lot of people that are living in the middle, not living on $2 a day. So one of the things that Wallerstein points out is that colonialism allowed the core countries to become core countries, and that because the countries that were colonized were essentially raped of their resources and raped of their well-being, that they will not be able to develop in the same way or anytime soon. There's no real specifics on that. I mean, they could develop eventually, but it's really going to limit their development because of the colonialization. So Africa was divided up with something called the Berlin Conference, and the Berlin Conference was when the European nations met in Berlin, which is the capital of Germany, and they decided how they were going to divide Africa up and how they were going to divide those resources up. So France got the most. So historically, England has always been the biggest colonizer, and they were number two, but France was number one. So you may encounter a lot of French speaking Africans around the world because of that French colonialism. And then you can also see the other countries that are listed there. They're all Western European countries that divided up Africa. And so colonialism, particularly in Africa, has really been difficult for Africa because when Europe, after World War II, decided to leave African colonies on their own, they just said, we just went through this devastating war. We can't afford any of this anymore. Yeah, there's probably a lot of resources there, but we can't deal with it. And so they left these countries on their own. They hadn't really invested in them as much as they had planned on because by 1914 they had World War One, and then by 1940 they had World War Two. So they had these big wars going on. They didn't do all this investment in Africa they were hoping for, and so these countries pretty much started out very beleaguered and really poor, very, very poorly off. Um, and the other big problem is that these countries were developed by Europe for the resources that each of those European countries wanted. And they never took into consideration the people who actually lived there and the tribes and how, like, some of the tribes were warring, and then, like, two warring tribes would be now crammed together in one country when they were decolonialized. Decolonialized. So here we're calling the world systems model, the core periphery model, just to remind you that there's the same thing. So what does the core look like? It's economically and politically dominant, has strong military, and it also has allies. It's highly interconnected transportation, communication, infrastructure. That's a word you need to know, infrastructure. Infrastructure just means highways, internet, anything that keeps us connected. Airplanes, that's part of infrastructure too. Control of the global market. Businesses are headquartered here. Former colonial powers, higher skill, capital intensive production. So, capital intensive production means that the things they need to produce in their countries it's really expensive to start out. So you think about our farming here in the United States, like, it's a really big business. It's a huge, you need these huge tractors, and everything is just really costly here. Go watch some farmers in India. You're going to see a really different way of farming, and that's because they don't have the capital intensive production that we have. We have capital intensive production. The US, the UK, Japan, Germany are examples. There, South Korea, there's other ones, but those are some really good examples. So this is a little model that explains how the core and the periphery are connected. And so the core buys raw materials from the periphery. It pays for the cheap labor from the periphery. So when we set up a factory in a periphery country, we're paying that cheap labor. And then we sell consumer goods for high prices. So a lot of goods that are designed in the United States. They're not always made in the United States, but they're designed in the United States. We turn around and we sell them in the periphery for a lot of money. And so that's why um, in other countries, like American goods are really sought after, and or at least, goods that were designed in America, they're now made everywhere else, right? But goods that were designed in America are really highly sought after. The periphery will pay those high prices for consumer goods as much as they can. And then that will deplete the supply and opportunities for investment. So, one of my favorite books is called Born a Crime by Trevor Noah. If you're a reader, I highly, highly recommend that you read it. It's really good for developing understanding in this class. And he talks about when South Africa, that's where he's from, when they got a McDonald's, like that was the place to be seen. That was like the cool place. Like everybody wanted to be seen there. You think about McDonald's here, that's not where we're lining up to, like have our Instagram pictures taken. That's not the place. So we've talked about the core periphery model and applying it to the world scale. So now let's look at a smaller scale. Look at a country scale. And we're going to look at applying this model to the core, semi-periphery, and periphery. So you have core cities in the United States, New York City, Chicago, Los Angeles. Those are core cities. They are economically and politically dominant. They're very highly interconnected. It's very easy to get a plane flight from Los Angeles to New York City. They do control a lot of the businesses. A lot of businesses are headquartered in these major cities, and they have very high skill. They're capital intensive. If you want, like, good you want to get a really good job, you want to get a really high paying job in a really top notch industry, you're going to end up in one of these major cities. And then there's the semi periphery. So, semi periphery is kind of your middle income areas. And so these have some aspects of the core, some aspects of the periphery. You do have some active manufacturing. We do have some exporting of raw goods or exporting of goods and raw materials. So we're also like doing some processing of raw materials. We have good transportation in these areas. Like you're going to have good highways, good connections. You're probably going to have good trains. You're probably going to have some bus systems. Some second tier cities are Cincinnati and Atlanta. Both of these are pretty big cities. Houston, Dallas, would be other semi periphery cities. And then our periphery cities are the less wealthier parts of the United States. They have lower levels of education than the core. There's actually places in the United States where the majority of people do not graduate from high school. They export a lot of natural resources, so they have a lot of mining. They also will be more likely to have some agriculture in those areas. You're not going to find bus systems. You're not going to find an airport. You're not going to find oftentimes trains going through there either. And then a lot of the jobs will be low skilled service jobs, low wages. Actually, those jobs working in the primary sector are going to be probably your higher paying jobs like mining and that kind of thing. And this is going to be your more rural areas of the United States. Now, you may be wondering, where are we in this equation? Well, we're more semi-periphery because we're really closely connected to Los Angeles. A lot of students think that in this area that we're rural because there used to be dairies, but this area is not rural. It's what is called suburban. We are connected to our core city, which is Los Angeles. Okay, I like the simplicity of the Brant line, which is the north-south divide, and it's based loosely on the northern and southern hemisphere. So the equator actually runs through, let me draw the equator for you. So the equator is actually down here. So there's your equator. So the equator's way down here. So actually, it's this right here is not really the equator. So it's based loosely on the northern and southern hemisphere. It's not really based upon the northern and southern hemisphere. Many of the newly industrialized countries, so those are the ones highlighted in yellow on the map on the right. So you have Mexico, Brazil, China, India, Malaysia, Thailand, South Africa. Those, well, South Africa is definitely not in the north. Um, yeah, those are more southern. So they're, there's those are starting to develop. So it's kind of the idea that eventually the development is going to spread away from the north. So at this point in your notes, I would like you to explain the different theories of economic and social development. I want you to explain Rostow's stages of economic growth, Wallerstein's world system theory, and also the Brandt line. And yeah, so explain those.